You thought Honda's Rebel 500 was untouchable, bulletproof, flawless, perfect. That's what they wanted you to believe. But inside the factories, behind closed doors, something went terribly wrong. Writers are uncovering the truth Honda kept quiet for years, and the fallout is just beginning. By the end of this, you'll question everything you ever trusted about that badge. The scandal's out, the silence is over, and what's coming next will change how you see Honda forever. The badge that lied. For decades, the name Honda stood for reliability. It was the quiet promise in every handshake between a salesman and a first-time rider. It was the badge that said, "This machine will not fail you." Generations believed it. From dusty back roads to the open highways, the Rebel series became the entry point into freedom. No drama, no defects, just that low, steady thump beneath you, and the belief that if you took care of it, it would take care of you. But belief can only last as long as truth holds it up. The shock began small. A few stories whispered on forums about bikes cutting out at red lights or coughing after a fill-up. Riders defended the brand like it was family. Probably bad fuel, someone said. Just break-in quirks. The idea that Honda, the gold standard of consistency, could slip up felt impossible. For many of us, those bikes were more than metal. They were trust made tangible, proof that good craftsmanship still existed in a world that cut corners. Then came the quiet dread. Photos appeared of bikes sitting half torn apart in home garages. Mechanics started muttering about odd service bulletins. Something was off, and the silence from corporate only made it louder. Pride started to feel like denial. The badge that once gleamed with certainty began to look different under harsh light. Maybe the reliability wasn't fading. It had been sold to us long after the truth had changed. We bought a Honda for peace of mind. What we got instead was the calm before a storm we didn't see coming. But paperwork was already piling up behind that shine. The paper trail nobody saw. It started with a few pages buried deep in the recall logs. Technical jargon that most riders would never read. The official term was evaporative emission canister charge hose replacement, dated between 2017 and 2018. To the untrained eye, it sounded harmless, like routine maintenance. But to anyone who spent years wrenching, those lines spoke volumes. It meant vapor escaping where it shouldn't, fuel fumes building pressure, and a design that slipped past the people paid to catch it. Whispers surfaced that the defect had been found months earlier inside internal tests. Emails hinted that quality assurance raised the flag, yet production never paused. One insider described it as a fix deferred for convenience. The defect didn't stop the bike from running, but it broke the company's image of perfection. A small crack in a spotless record is all it takes for trust to start bleeding out. Riders who later brought their bikes in for unrelated issues sometimes found the recall attached to their VINs without ever being told. Service departments replaced parts quietly, under warranty, avoiding headlines. No apology letters. No bold press releases, just a corporate whisper through the system. It was a paper trail built to disappear. When the documents finally surfaced through public recall databases, it wasn't journalists who noticed first. It was writers. Garage owners compared the repair codes, realizing the same hose defect crossed states and years. Honda called it a compliance update. The writers called it what it was: negligence in plain sight. The deeper you looked, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a sign of something rotting further down the line, a company so confident in its legend that it thought no one would ever question it. Those files pointed straight back to the plant. If you've ever trusted a badge more than a boardroom, hit that like button right now. It tells Honda, and every company watching, that writers still care about truth over polish. And drop a comment below. Your story, your voice, your miles, they're the proof that this community doesn't stay silent inside the factory fog. Behind the neat showrooms and polished commercials, the real story was happening under fluorescent lights, inside the plants where the Rebel 500 rolled off the line. Deadlines started to matter more than diligence. The older workers noticed it first. They'd built bikes by feel, tightening bolts not because a computer told them to, but because experience did. They began seeing parts arrive with small inconsistencies: plastic connectors that flexed too much, clamps that looked thinner, tolerances that didn't feel right. Supervisors told them to keep the line moving. Orders from above were clear: numbers first. The industry was recovering from a global slowdown, and delays cost money. So inspections were optimized. A skipped torque check here, a visual sign-off there. It added up quietly, invisibly. One former technician described it as building reliability on a stopwatch. Supplier contracts came under pressure too. Cheaper batches, faster shipments, and promises that it'll pass Tecton. The system rewarded quantity, not conscience. And when those same parts started failing after a few thousand miles, the blame didn't land on the spreadsheets. It landed on the riders. Inside those walls, pride was thinning. What used to be a brotherhood of builders was turning into a race against production charts. It wasn't sabotage. It was neglect disguised as efficiency. That's how myths die. Not in explosions, but in meetings where people stop caring enough to say no. Every corner of that plant carried the echo of the same excuse. We've always been fine. But fine is not the same as flawless. And while the managers chased quotas, riders chased miles. Before we keep going, a quick reminder. Ride prepared, not surprised. The gear and accessories I actually use are linked below. Let's get back into it. The trust gap. For years, Honda meant safety. Parents handed down Rebels to their kids because they trusted the machine more than the teenager learning to ride it. That was the power of reputation, earned then inherited. But once the cracks began to show, a strange quiet settled across the community. Riders who'd sworn by the brand started speaking in the past tense. Used to be the best, they'd say, leaning over coffee-stained diner tables. Trust doesn't vanish overnight. It erodes with every unanswered question. Each ignored complaint, each vague recall notice, each corporate statement that said, customer satisfaction remains our priority while leaving the problem unaddressed, it all added up. What had once been pride started to feel like betrayal. At bike nights, conversations changed. The laughter was still there, but so was the edge. The nervous joke about stalling at intersections, the shrug about squeaky brakes. These weren't outliers anymore. They were warnings. Riders began to realize that the same company that once stood for bulletproof dependability was now ducking accountability. No one wanted to hate Honda. That's what made it hurt worse. These were riders who had chosen Rebels over flashier machines because they valued reliability over vanity. When that reliability cracked, so did the bond between man and machine. It wasn't just a brand losing face, it was riders losing faith. What's left when faith fades? A kind of cautious loyalty, the kind that eyes every new model with suspicion. The Rebel 500 still looks good on a sales floor, still hums the way a Honda should, but every spark of pride now flickers with doubt. Then the breakdowns started showing up on real roads. The stall nobody could explain. It began on a scorching afternoon in the heart of summer. The kind of day when the air sticks to your gloves and the asphalt ripples in the heat. A rider in Texas had just filled up his Rebel 500, checked the mirrors, and eased out of the station. 2 blocks later, the engine coughed once and went silent. No sputter, no warning, no mercy. Cars behind him swerved, horns blared. He rolled to the shoulder, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what just happened. Across the country, riders shared the same story. Rebel 500 stalling mid-turn, at lights, on climbs. New bikes acted old, dying without warning like they'd lost a heartbeat. Mechanics guessed, cleaned, replaced, but nothing fixed it. The pattern was undeniable, yet unprovable. For a brand built on precision, the mystery felt personal. Simplicity had turned into danger, and confidence leaked out faster than fuel. If you've ever ridden through that moment, when your machine betrays you in motion, you know it changes something inside you. You stop hearing the wind. You start listening for failure. If the engine went silent, the brakes were next. The brake question. The first time it happened, most riders brushed it off. The rear pedal felt soft, almost spongy, but not enough to panic over. It was easy to blame the road, the weather, maybe a low fluid day. But soft brakes have a way of turning mild concern into real fear fast. Mechanics began noticing the same issue, slight inconsistencies in the hydraulic feel. especially after long rides. The front system stayed crisp, but the rear? It was unpredictable. Sometimes it grabbed too hard, other times it barely slowed the bike at all. And on a machine that weighs over 400 pounds, that inconsistency could mean the difference between stopping in time and sliding across gravel. The issue wasn't a clear defect, but a hidden mismatch. Shared parts from lighter Hondas failing under the Rebel's weight. Brake modulators that looked fine on paper faltered in motion. "You never forget when the pedal sinks," an Arizona rider said. Honda's bulletin spoke of performance feel and expected variability, phrases that sounded responsible until real roads demanded the truth their paperwork refused to say. Brakes are more than mechanics, they're faith made tangible. You don't think about them until you need them. And when they falter, every other part of the bike feels suspect. Honda once sold faith by the gallon. Now even that was leaking away. And then came a defect so small it hid in plain sight. The ghost in the lights. It sounded laughable at first. A recall over rear reflectors. Plastic lenses that didn't meet a visibility angle. To most riders it seemed cosmetic, barely worth a headline. But to those who understand how a small oversight signals a larger rot, this was a siren. Federal standards, specifically the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 108, require a set angle of light reflection for visibility at night. Honda's Rebel 500 missed that angle, just a few degrees shy but enough to violate the law. The recall paperwork called it non-compliant rear reflectors. The phrasing was sterile, but the meaning was loud. If something as basic as a reflector slipped past inspection, what else had? It wasn't about being seen, it was about being believed. Honda's legacy of precision and trust shattered with a simple oversight, a failure to reflect. Writers questioned how a company famed for perfection could miss something so basic. The shine that once symbolized excellence now blinded its makers, turning a small defect into a metaphor for decay. Proof that the unthinkable had quietly become routine. One dealership mechanic summed it up during a late phone call to a friend. The reflector was never the issue, it was the attitude. That attitude, that quiet arrogance of assuming perfection without earning it, was what truly dimmed the brand's glow. A small reflection problem revealed a bigger truth. Value was already bleeding out. The value leak. The market doesn't wait for excuses. When the first wave of issues hit the web, used prices for the Rebel 500 began to slide. At first, just a few $100s, then more. Within a year, bikes that once sold for nearly $6,000 were going for $4,000. The depreciation hit faster than anyone expected. For older riders, that drop wasn't just numbers, it was personal. Many had bought the Rebel because it represented dependable value. Hondas were supposed to hold their worth like old hand tools. But now, clean models sat for weeks in classifieds, untouched. Dealers quietly reduced trade-in offers, calling it market correction. Everyone knew better. Even riders untouched by failures felt the stigma. Buyers asked, "Before the recall?" Or, "Has the hose fixed?" Turning every sale into confession. Many kept their bikes riding out of pride instead of joy. It wasn't greed, it was respect. Honda's unwritten deal promised lasting value for loyal investment, but that value vanished the moment trust cracked, leaving pride as the only currency riders had left. In garages across the country, you could feel the mood shift. The same men who once bragged about bulletproof Hondas now spoke with hesitation. "Still runs fine," they'd say, almost defending it to themselves. That's the quiet heartbreak of a market crash. It doesn't just drain wallets, it drains pride. What started as a mechanical issue had turned into a cultural one. The Rebel 500 was supposed to be the everyman's motorcycle, the safe bet, the beginner's badge of honor. Now it was a cautionary tale told between bites of diner pie. Dealers were the next to feel the heat. Dealers in the crossfire. Walk into a small-town Honda dealership, and you can feel the tension before anyone says a word. The smell of oil and rubber hangs in the air, but behind the counter, there's something heavier, unease. Service advisors shuffle paperwork with forced smiles. Managers check emails a little too often. And techs in grease-stained uniforms whisper about orders from above. They're not the enemy, but they're caught between loyalty and livelihood. When stalling and brake complaints surged, dealers first patched issues quietly, bleeding lines replacing hoses, calming nerves. Then corporate tightened control. Limit warranties, document everything, never speculate. Mechanics became gatekeepers, torn between riders and policy. Some covered repairs themselves, others denied claims by the book. "We used to sell confidence, now we sell apologies," said one Kansas owner, capturing an industry where silence replaced trust, and back orders spoke louder than loyalty ever could. It wasn't that the dealers didn't care, they cared too much. They'd built communities, sponsored rides, hosted open house weekends. Now they stood on the front lines of a reputational war they didn't start. Their phone lines buzzed with calls from riders demanding transparency. But all corporate sent were memos filled with empty reassurances. The human link between Honda and its customers was fraying fast. For every denied claim, another rider walked out feeling betrayed. And for every rider lost, another dealership lost faith in the company that made them who they were. The crossfire was no longer metaphorical, it was personal. When official answers dried up, riders started finding their own. The forum detectives. It began in the quiet hours of frustration. Riders sitting in dim garages, half-drained cups of coffee beside them, laptops open on oily workbenches. The official channels had failed, so they built their own. One post turned into 10 turned into hundreds. VENG numbers, repair dates, states, symptoms, it all went online. What looked like noise at first soon became a map of truth. A retired Oregon mechanic built a spreadsheet. A Florida writer mapped failures by month. Soon, forums became research labs where owners dissected fuel lines, decoded recalls, and exposed buried truths. Anger turned into determination as riders formed a self-made rebel research department. Each VN logged became evidence, drawing reporters and proving what Honda denied. This wasn't chance or chatter, but organized proof built by riders who refused to be silenced or misled again. The community had done what the corporation wouldn't: connect the dots. Their evidence forced regulators to listen. When regulators knocked, the first sign came quietly, a notice filed by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration requesting information from Honda's U.S. division. It wasn't an accusation yet, but it was the start of something serious. Regulators had seen the same patterns riders exposed online, and they wanted answers. Every recall claim, every repair invoice, every internal email became potential evidence. Inside Honda's offices, panic spread as compliance teams scrambled and lawyers crafted empty statements. Investigators wanted accountability, not marketing. Honda's once spotless safety legacy unraveled. This wasn't a supplier error, but a failure of attention. Regulators demanded answers about delayed recalls, uninformed dealers, and riders learning truths online. Hearings shook the industry. Blunt questions. When did you know? And what did you do? Exposed how corporate caution had replaced integrity, leaving every manufacturer suddenly afraid of its own silence. Reports circulated that internal audits uncovered communication gaps between Japan and U.S. operations. Translation delays, misfiled testing reports, even mislabeled parts data. All small failures that built into a massive breach of trust. Regulators cited negligence. Honda called it process misalignment. Whatever the label, the message was clear. The system meant to protect riders had protected the brand instead. By the time the first fines were discussed, it didn't even matter if they were small or large. It was moral. The government had knocked, and the legend had flinched. Washington asked for data. Tokyo stayed quiet. If you've made it this far, you're part of the few who still believe in real accountability. Subscribe and stay with us, because the next chapter of this investigation is already unfolding. More leaks, more evidence, more truth. delivered straight to riders who refused to be left in the dark. The silence from Tokyo. When the headlines hit, many expected a public reckoning, a heartfelt apology, an executive stepping up to say, "We failed you." But Honda's official response was measured, almost surgical. They expressed regret for the inconvenience and reaffirmed their commitment to excellence. It was language polished to death, the kind that admits nothing, pretending to say everything. Behind polished statements, Honda's pride turned into denial. In Tokyo, meetings prioritized image over riders. Customer service repeated scripts instead of solutions. Fearing global backlash, executives chose silence, hoping the storm would fade. But silence amplifies truth. Every ignored message and unanswered call fueled riders' resolve, proving that Honda's quietest moment became its loudest admission of guilt. One insider later described those months as a war between pride and principle. Engineers wanted transparency. Executives wanted control. Pride won, but only for a moment. Because when people who build machines forget who rides them, they lose something no statement can restore. That silence didn't end the story. It lit the next fight. The demand for accountability. When the smoke cleared, one truth remained. Riders didn't want revenge. They wanted responsibility. After months of silence, it wasn't enough for Honda to say the right words. Community wanted actions, receipts, and proof that lessons had been learned. They wanted technical bulletins that told the full story, not the edited version that made lawyers comfortable. They wanted to see data, inspection logs, and part redesigns laid bare. The people who bought these bikes had earned honesty the hard way. Mile by mile, breakdown by breakdown. Dealers cautiously demanded clarity, fair warranties, steady parts, honest communication. Riders echoed them, calling for transparent testing and direct dialogue with engineers. Some proposed a rider-led oversight board of owners, mechanics, and inspectors. It wasn't rebellion, but loyalty. These weren't critics destroying Honda. They were believers fighting to protect the badge's integrity and the trust it once represented. Accountability doesn't require speeches. It requires courage, the kind that admits, "We failed you, and here's how we'll make it right." Riders across the country were ready to forgive, but not forget. The next move was Honda's, and everyone was watching. But waiting for them isn't a plan. The rider's playbook. In garages, living rooms, and roadside diners, riders started building their own defense manual. They didn't have corporate backing or legal teams, just experience and grit. The first rule was simple: document everything. Every oil change, every recall letter, every trip to the dealership went into folders thick as repair manuals. They learned to speak the language of accountability, matching corporate precision with blue-collar discipline. Riders learned their VINs, tracked defect batches, and demanded answers. Complaints became organized records, not rants. Forums shared templates, mechanics taught inspections, and lawyers guided accountability. This quiet uprising turned independence into structure, anger into action. Every document, photo, and checklist became armor, proving riders could defend themselves better than any corporation ever protected them. The lesson was clear: never surrender your safety to silence. The same grit that keeps a rider steady in crosswinds now kept them steady in confrontation. This wasn't rebellion, it was maturity on two wheels. As riders organized, the rest of the industry took notice. The ripple effect: when one brand stumbles, the whole market feels the tremor. Within months of the Rebel scandal breaking, boardrooms across the industry grew quieter. Yamaha, Suzuki, and Kawasaki all ordered internal audits of their production lines. Supplier contracts were rechecked, and safety reports once buried in filing cabinets were reopened. No one wanted to be next in the crosshairs. Across factories, meetings shifted from output to safety, empowering quality teams and engineers to double-check every part. Investors demanded transparency, regulators expanded oversight, and the myth of too reliable to fail collapsed. From Thailand to the American Midwest, workers spoke out, inspired by riders' defiance. Proof that honesty, once optional, had become the industry's new survival code. The ripple didn't stop at factories. Suppliers began branding themselves as transparency certified, offering to publish inspection data publicly to rebuild trust between manufacturers and consumers. Writers had more than customers. They were watchdogs for an entire ecosystem. For once, the balance of power had shifted. Corporations were no longer the storytellers. The road itself had started talking. But beneath all the noise, one truth kept echoing. The final truth. When the dust finally settled, what remained wasn't rage, it was clarity. The badge that once lied had forced riders to rediscover what loyalty really means. It isn't blind faith in a logo or a marketing slogan. It's faith in each other, the people who ride, refuse to look away. Every scandal leaves a scar, but scars harden into wisdom. Riders now know trust isn't granted, but inspected. Community outlasts corporations as garages and forums became the true heart of culture. Dealers, mechanics, and writers united by purpose reclaimed a legacy once lost. The Rebel 500 still rides, proof that honesty, not perfection, endures forever. Somewhere on a quiet back road, a rider pulls over, shuts the engine off, and listens. The hum fades, replaced by the sound of wind through trees. For the first time in a long time, that silence feels peaceful. Not corporate, not scripted, just real. The badge still lies there on the tank, but its meaning has changed. It no longer stands for perfection. It stands for persistence. It belongs not to the brand, but to the rider who refuses to let truth rust away. That silence didn't end the story. It made it ours. They called it precision. We called it trust. But when the truth surfaced, it wasn't chrome that cracked. It was the silence holding it together. The Rebel 500 story isn't just about machines. It's about riders who refuse to look away. Because loyalty without honesty is just branding. Real brotherhood? That's built on truth, forged in miles, and proven by those who still ride. Eyes open, engines honest, and hearts unbought.